most of the people coming in was deliberate and legal, because the Conservative Party said, we actually want to do this.
Politicians have been able to use mass low-skill immigration to solve specific problems, like the social care problem, and generally the economy runs on low-skill migration.
The thing about Brexit was, it was not done by the Conservative Party, it was done to the Conservative Party. Vote Leave was not a Conservative thing. The Conservative Party leader, David Cameron, was very firmly on the other side, as was the official party. So I think that also is a clue, right? Like, by far the biggest, most important thing done in a, quote, conservative, unquote, direction was not done by the Conservative Party, but done to the Conservative Party. And that fact also is part of the reason why they struggled so much to cope with it, and why, after we won the referendum, they essentially spent 3 years just going into a tailspin and driving the country into a biggest constitutional crisis in a century, because it wasn't their idea, they didn't want to do it. And therefore, once they started having meetings with Whitehall officials about what to do, they ended up just completely paralyzed. I think the core, so I think there's a couple of core things to answer your question. Number one, you have to think about the intellectual and kind of psychological, emotional environment. Most Conservative MPs have been essentially since 2010 on the same side as Tony Blair and the Labour Party on almost all important issues. On the economy, on public services, on crime, on immigration, on the UCHR, on net zero, on Brexit. So that's the first thing. They're called Conservative, but essentially what they mean is go in the same direction as the left, but in a slightly different way and with different people in charge. Secondly, at the core is that what's happened in Britain over a period of more than a century is the gradual ending of the old ministerial responsibility to Parliament, which was the foundation of the British Constitution, and its replacement by a permanent class of officials in Whitehall who have most of the power. So if you look now, say, at the Cabinet Secretary is not really covered by the media at all, but the Cabinet Secretary is 100 times more powerful than any normal British government minister, apart from the Prime Minister himself. He actually controls the personnel system, the hiring, and the promotion and compensation for hundreds of thousands of people in Whitehall. That's real power. That power used to be exercised by by political forces responsible to Parliament. So as that power has shifted, it also means that over a very long period of time, you have this phenomenon whereby the political parties and MPs talk a lot of stuff in the old media about what they think and what they're going to do, but it bears less and less resemblance to anything real when they're in power, when they just continue to do what the bureaucratic institutions want to do. And you can see that happening now with Starmer, right? Starmer promises change, promises a fundamental change of direction, and now, a year later, Labour MPs are scratching their heads and saying, why does it seem like we're in charge, but the government is just continuity Rishi Sunak? This seems quite baffling to us. But the core reason is because the ministers are not fundamentally in charge of the government. The officials are in charge of the government, and the meetings that the ministers are in are essentially Potemkin meetings that are all scripted.
Thank you. Well, I guess what we saw in Yes Minister has become far worse. But I will give
yes,
the floor
exactly.
now
Yes
to
Minister
Jacob.
is a training manual, not comedy.
Yeah,
Jacob, as an Hellenist, how do you see this?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd add one thing to the picture that Dominic painted, especially when you were talking about the kind of psychological identification that most of the Conservative Party have actually with Labour or Blairite policies, which is also a kind of ideological and social identification they have with each other, with the entire political class. This is something you kind of talked about in your introduction, that the reason why, if you have a Conservative government or a Labour government, it doesn't necessarily seem to make much difference, is because they're part of the same system. They not just kind of send their kids to the same schools or hang out together kind of privately, but also fundamentally their interests and their whole career trajectory came through a system that, as you say, was designed for a very different era, but today functions predominantly to protect the interests of those who are in the system. And
exactly.
So the fact that you can't really put a paper between a Labour or a Conservative government, that there's very little difference in their policies, is precisely because they exist as almost free-floating class of individuals who have no real connection to the wider public, have no identification with the things that ordinary people want, that are prepared to occasionally say, kind of give a little bit of rhetorical ground in talking about migration or talking about the economy, but actually have no interest in really seeing these things through. And that's why the point that you made about the need for not just a kind of change in government, but a change of an entire system, that's why that, I think, at this moment resonates so strongly, not just with some of the elites you talk about, but also the wider public. People see that this is a uniparty, a regime, a complete system, and that whole thing has to be turfed out.
Mick?
Yeah, I think, sorry, is this working now? Yeah. The most remarkable achievement, I think it's very difficult for people who think of themselves as conservatives, and I meet a lot of people in Brussels and Europe who still think the Conservative Party is part of their system. It's very difficult to come to terms with what the Tory party have done and have become. I think their most amazing, most remarkable achievement of the Tory government over 14 years is basically to dig their own grave, to sign their own death warrant. And that is something from the party that for 200 years has been the most successful political machine, certainly in Britain and arguably in Europe and beyond. That they have made conservatism in Britain a dirty word. When I was working with Nigel Farage's Reform Party in the last election campaign, at the end of the campaign I went to knock on some doors in Clacton where Nigel was standing to try and kind of get a sense of the public. And you almost felt when you knocked on the door, in a very, very strong Conservative seat, always had been, you knocked on the door, the first thing you had to say was, I'm not a Tory, I'm not a Conservative, because people would, would almost chase you out of their street, but such was the anger and the fury about it. That they have betrayed everything that people expected them to stand for. There is nothing conservative about any of their policies, from net zero, the opening of the borders of mass migration, and Brexit, as Dominic rightly points out, is the key thing to understand that that's the great achievement of British politics in the last 14 years, is Brexit, is the popular revolt against the establishment that won the Brexit vote. And the Conservative Party were against that. David Cameron, who described himself, we must remember, as the heir to Blair, called that referendum absolutely confident that they would win. In fact, we should thank David Cameron from the bottom of our hearts. The one great achievement of his was to call to be stupid enough to call that referendum in 2016 and imagine that he was going to win it. They were against it. And then under May, they spent 3 years trying to destroy it. And then when Boris won the terrific victory with some help from Nigel in 2019 on the slogan, "Get Brexit done," they didn't. In fact, he opened the borders even more and destroyed Britain's national sovereignty. So the one thing that people counted on for the Conservatives to do, they've been completely against. So I think we should really recognise that they are, the last 200 years has come to an end as far as the Tory party is concerned, and we have to recognise there's a need for something else.
Could I just add a couple of things on that? So just on your first point, as an example of what you were saying about how it's kind of like one social network, 3 weeks after we won the 2019 election, it was early January 2020, and I was sitting in the Prime Minister's office with Boris, and he said to me, what are you going to be doing, what are you doing this month? And I said, well, I'm having meetings with all of these people, the heads of the British Army, the intelligence services, the Cabinet Office, people in planning, people in procurement, etc. Like, now we've got to deliver what we said we were going to do. We promised everyone this huge change, now we have to deliver it. And Boris's reply was, no. What I want you to do now is make friends with the media. What we've got to do now is make friends with everybody again. And I think this goes to the heart of the problem, right? Fundamentally, we in Vote Leave did vote leave, we did Brexit, because we wanted to change the country profoundly in a different direction. But Boris, as soon as we won the election, his fundamental priority was repairing his social networks with the old London world. And secondly, on Mick's point, what he says about the Conservative Party is correct, but here's an example of how profound the weirdness is in what they did. They destroyed themselves, But now the conventional wisdom, if you look at the most high status pundits writing in places like the London Times, etc., the conventional wisdom about what happened 2024 is they lost because, quote, they lurched so far to the right, unquote, right? Now it's a kind of insanity. So with Boris and Sunak, they literally used taxpayers' money to put on a wedding for the most famous child serial killer in the country. And they did this because they said they had no alternative thanks to the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, right? This is what they literally did. But their self-explanation inside the system for why they went wrong was, we lurched to the right. And I think it's impossible to understand the meltdown of the old Conservative Party without also understanding this weird parallel world which the old media system has developed. And you can see it on COVID, you can see it on Ukraine, you can see it on every important issue, where they herd to these extraordinary positions in a complete delusional parallel reality. But then the MPs treat this delusional reality as if it is actually reality. And that's why you see this constant process of weird, what I call narrative whiplash. Like in January, Keir Starmer saying, no, the real story is not the grooming gangs, the real story is Elon Musk and Twitter and far-right conspiracy theories. Oh, 5 months later, there's an official inquiry into the grooming gangs. And this process just keeps happening in a kind of accelerating tailspin.
Staying on this topic, partly at least, because I think we really kind of went into in depth what's wrong with the Conservative Party, but we might have a slimmer of hope. So if you look at the polls, then the Reform Party is doing extremely well. I mean, in the past 3 or 4 months, they had a stable lead, which has seemed to be increasing. So my question here is, do they have a chance? I mean, historically, you can argue that the UK was like a 2.5 party state. Kind of the devolution changed it a bit, but usually, kind of outside parties don't fare well, and Reform Party, although it did well in the past local elections, still, if you look at kind of general elections, they usually didn't do as well. I mean, Farage and his previous parties. But now they seem to be doing well, and also on the media question, I think they really effectively used, like what Trump was doing, kind of alternative media outlets, and not use the mainstream media. So my question really is, do they have a chance, and kind of what's the future of conservatism in the UK in a sense? If you don't have the Conservatives, can Reform be the Conservative Party? I think Jacob wants to start now here.
Yeah, well, just to give a sense of, which I think is important, of the scale of the opportunity, and maybe my colleagues on the panel might be a better place to talk about whether Reform are the right alternative, but the scale of the opportunity is enormous for lots of reasons, but 2 stand out. One is that, in contrast to lots of European countries, we have first past the post in the United Kingdom, which means that the system is very, very hard to penetrate for outsiders. But suddenly, when it changes, you have an opportunity to completely change the system. And that's something that but whilst for a long time I know people that wanted a significant change talked about reforming the voting system, actually we're in a position now in the UK where there's an enormous opportunity to have a whole clean sweep of the system, and that's really important. And secondly, the degree to which in the UK at the moment we're seeing the complete erosion of the sustaining narrative that allowed the system to kind of have at least some air of plausibility among ordinary people. And it's almost become a topic in itself in the UK, how you now hear things from ordinary people, your grandma, your auntie, your friends, that you just wouldn't have heard even a year ago, even 6 months ago. And so the possibility of an enormous clean sweep change is really, 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 really big in the UK. And that's why, whether some people like it or not, and maybe a panelist can get into this, but the alternative at the moment is Reform. And the question is, what does Reform really need in order to better grasp that huge void that there is in British politics, and to really kind of win the trust of the people that are desperate for some kind of an alternative? And and that's where I think a lot of work is hopefully being done. Maybe Mick is better placed in this, but hopefully lots of work's been done in that direction. But I just really wanted to give a sense of the enormous opportunity that there is in British politics, and makes it one of the most exciting periods that we could possibly go through.
Mick?
Yeah, I agree with that, what Jacob was saying there.
if you put it in the European context, there's a sense that in which Britain was always seen as different, not only because they voted for Brexit, but because the two-party system seemed to survive in Britain, where in other countries the old parties had disappeared. And what we've seen now is that those two old parties were really empty shells, and that we're going the same way as the European system, where the Italian Christian Democrats can run the country 50 years and then just disappear. And we got the same kind of breakdown of an old order in Britain. I think the opportunity for reform is huge, and not only because of what they're doing, but because, as Nigel Farage himself is very fond of saying, there's something happening out there in the way that Jacob was just talking about. There's a kind of popular revolt taking place against the political establishment, a very quiet one, or it's getting less and less quiet with the protests against migrants being put up in luxury hotels, etc. And I think it's a very profound opportunity, and I think reform is the only race in town, horse in the race as far as that is concerned. And I think this is not a protest vote. This is what all the establishment parties keep saying, oh, this is a protest vote, it's midterm and everything. This is something much more profound than that. This is some people expressing the absolute negative rejection of the status quo and a positive will for something different. And I think the principles that reform are enunciating, obviously the kind of problems we're talking about here in terms of how do you break down the deep state and everything are very profound. But the principles that reform are elaborating, beginning with getting Britain out of the European Convention of Human Rights and re-establishing national sovereignty, have a real popular appeal that gives them an absolutely huge opportunity. What they did in those local elections in May, the Conservatives have run Kent County on the south coast of England is where the small boats come to from France. The Conservatives have run Kent since the Norman Conquest or thereabouts. They removed them entirely, more or less, from Kent County Council and took control of it. And you've reached the tipping point, whereas I think Jacob's alluding to, people will now tell you they're going to vote for reform in a way that it would have been a secret reform voter in the past. It's now become a publicly acceptable thing to do. Not in dinner party circles in London, but around much of the country. So I think the opportunity for them is tremendous, and that if we really want to change things, you've got to get behind them. Now, there is another discussion to be had about what are you going to do? How are you going to change the system? How are you going to deal with this, with the kind of dark forces that we're up against once you're in office? But that's not a reason not to try. That's not a reason not to get behind a kind of popular revolt against the establishment, which, in the spirit of Brexit, is something that many of us have been waiting for our whole lives.
Dominic?
Yeah, I think so. There's no doubt that reform could win. Polls are clear. Both parties are in unprecedentedly low positions. Both of them are led by people self-evidently incapable of doing the job. The public has looked at both of them and knows that both of them are completely hopeless. So you've got two institutions which themselves are completely rotting. Hard to overstate the institutional kind of decay and collapse of the Conservative Party. An entity that was an incredibly thriving social entity 50 years ago is now dead. You have a Conservative Party meeting in places that the thousands of people would have gone decades ago. Now 8 people turn up and they're all kind of over 70 or something. So at a profound level, at the grassroots level, the Conservative Party is done, it's finished. I think the really big questions are, first of all, as Nigel himself has said, reform was in the 2024 election and still is essentially Nigel plus an iPhone. Now, Nigel and an iPhone can get more votes than anybody else in the next election, and he can destroy the Conservative Party in the next election for sure. But nobody in an iPhone can take over a whole government system in a G7 country and actually get to grips with all the problems that we've talked about. So the fundamental question, I think, for reform is, can they set out a story and then execute it of how, in contrast to these two broken, declining, rotten old parties, can they tell a story of how reform goes around the country and recruits wonderful people from all walks of life, people who are soldiers, people who run NHS hospitals, people in education, who are scientific researchers, etc. Do you see a process whereby reform tries to build that and recruit that? If it does that, then the situation will be profoundly different. And the second big thing is, this question of actually controlling the system. Liz Truss came in 2022 with all kinds of claims about what she was going to do, and she was spat out in 40 days. For reform, or for anybody, if reform can't do it for someone else, to actually control the system, you need a detailed plan from the first hour of when you walk into the number 10 building of, these are the critical jobs you have to occupy, these people must be removed, these people must be replaced, these are the critical institutional nodes in the network that you must actually control, properly control, in a way that no British government has actually controlled for decades. And that means at the core of it, going back to what I said in my talk, there is a central, profound question which everyone needs to answer before the 2028-29 election. Are you going to carry on with the old Whitehall system of a century? Or is the new government actually going to control the government? And that means telling Whitehall, we now control appointments, not you. And that is the test. And Farage is going to have to develop a set of people that can figure out that plan and then actually execute it from day one. Because otherwise you'll have the same process. You'll have people voting for change, reform takes over, and then you'll just see a train wreck as the old system collapses, the new political thing. Exactly what's happened with Boris, exactly what's happened after Boris, after the Vote Leave team left number 10. Deep state, he goes along with it, completely implosion. Truss ditto, Sunak ditto, Starmer ditto. So Nigel needs to get a plan for how to avoid the same fate.
Before I give it to you, I want to kind of add a second question into this, because we're kind of beating around the bush, but where does this leave the Conservative Party? I mean, they will have a party conference. Will Kimi survive that? Is there kind of a hope for a leader? Will they try to make a deal with reform? I mean, increasingly, it seems that they are the junior partner in this. So please say your comment and perhaps also answer this.
Yeah, well,
where does this leave the Conservatives?
First of all, on Dominic's point about, sorry, I'm sounding like a reform PR act today, but you know.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you. On Dominic's point about Nigel, as you say, he describes himself as Nigel and an iPhone, or as the Tories rather, dismissively talk about, he's a one-man band. My first point would be, well, at least Reform have got a man. At least they've got a leader. And that sets them apart from anybody else on the political scene in the first place, as a charismatic leader who can appeal to public, who can appeal to different generations, by the way, and has more followers on TikTok, which I believe is in some kind of Chinese website, but has more followers on TikTok than every other member of the British Parliament put together, because he has a very successful young team behind him on that. So, and as far as the recruiting people, and this comes back to your point about the future of the Tory party, I agree with Dominic that they need to get good professional people around them. That's beginning to happen. The new Law and Order Commissioner they've got is a top former policeman. That's the kind of direction that they're going to be moving in. But I think that will happen with time. And the closer we get to the election, the more that will happen, because people will want to get on board. But so far, the main job has been trying to keep the bad people out.
Yeah.
You know, you've got a queue of failed Tories now lining up who want to get on the reform bandwagon.
Yeah, dangerous for reform, that.
I mean, it's a very, very dangerous thing. And obviously, some of them are going to get in. Hopefully, not very many of them. I think Nigel is aware of this. You know, but that's a sign of the fact of the kind of rats deserting the sinking ship phenomenon with the Tory party. That these people see that they are, like Lee Anderson, a good guy, ex-miner, Tory MP, left and went to reform in the last election and told all of his friends on the right wing of the Tory party they should do the same thing if they wanted to survive in politics. None of them did. And they all said it was a big regret that he'd gone. He's the only one that's still in Parliament of that group he was talking to. So some of those people are good, but a lot of them, I think, the Reform office doors are now being battered down by former Tory advisors and think tanks and all these people saying, we can help you. To which they say, no thanks, we're all right for Tory advisors. But I think that is both a problem for Reform, and I think they're setting about dealing with it, but it's also a sign of how desperate things are for the Tory party, that they just don't see a future in it. Rightly, I think.
Jacob, any comment?
Yeah, so I think Mick's completely right that the overriding kind of priority has to be to avoid, I mean, you asked, are they going to make deals, are the Tories going to try and make deals with reform, etc. If you've got any, if what is true, if what's been described as true, that you've got not just a need for a change in government, but a kind of systemic crisis, a real need for a wholesale change, the absolute priority has got to be avoiding making deals with the Tories, avoiding making deals with anyone, because only an external force is capable of the kind of widespread change that's really, really needed. And I'd add, and you asking about the Tory party conference, can the Tories find a good leader, all the rest of it. One, just the degree to which any of the possible kind of candidates that the Tory party could put forward are implicated in this is illustrated quite well by the fact that so many of the names that are thrown about have either been in one of these disastrous Tory governments for some time or presided over significant disasters. I mean, for people in the audience who might not be aware, but one of the most shocking things seems to happen almost every day now, but we're still dealing with the fallout of an enormous conspiracy that the British government, propagated by the Conservatives and by the Labour Party, took part in to fly Afghani soldiers and dependents and all the rest of it into the UK, house them, feed them. Yeah, and many of them which are terrorists, right? And this was not just, it wasn't just a system they came up with. They then came up with an incredible legal device to keep it secret from the public and went to court time and time again to make sure that nobody could even talk about this, right? The degree to which this class is desperate to insulate itself from any amount of criticism, from any amount of publicity, that's an illustration of the need for a wholesale change. And then just one final point, which is that really important, as you say, Dominic, that there's a plan, but I think one of the lessons we might learn from the failure of the Liz Truss moment was also you've got to be open and public about the plan. You've got to prepare people for what's necessary. You've got to start talking about it openly, that we're going to be doing this, that, and the other. Not just so you don't scare the markets, but also so that you win the kind of public support for what is going to be a really difficult few weeks, months, years, not just in terms of the economy, but in terms of the sheer kind of courage and effort that's going to be needed to implement these changes.
Yeah, I strongly agree. The only way really is there needs to be a public, detailed description in advance of the election saying, this is the scale of the problem, this is how we're actually going to control the government to do it, this is what it means in Whitehall terms for a government to control the government for the first time in decades. And you need to have a democratic mandate for that, so that then when you put legislation through, because remember also, because of the evolution of the judicial system and particularly how judicial review now works, all of this stuff will be challenged by the left in the courts. And that will itself require a kind of like parallel or meta battle whereby you change how judicial review works, you potentially change how the Supreme Court works. You need primary legislation to control parts of the Whitehall system, and you're going to have to get the House of Lords to go along with it and all of these things. So there's going to be a big constitutional battle in the first 12 months. A new regime will need to introduce legislation immediately, push it through Parliament, push it through the House of Lords, and then deal with the lawfare that will come back at you. And to get all of that done will require a clear democratic mandate.
Yeah, no, I agree with that entirely. And of course, Liz Truss didn't have any democratic mandate. Not only did she keep her plan secret, but she didn't have any democratic mandate to implement anything. So, but that's very, very key. But just I wanted to make one point about, I forgot about the Tories, and as a source of wisdom on many things in the world today, Donald Trump, when he was in Scotland, in that hilarious cameo of him with Starmer next to him, Trump like the King of Scotland and Starmer like some kind of serf in attendance to him. And when Trump was kind of lecturing Starmer about what he needed to do, he said, it's obviously a two-horse race going, a two-party thing, Labour and Reform. And if you want to win, what you've got to do is cut taxes and stop immigration, which is basically telling Starmer you can't win, because he can't do either of those things. But what was fascinating about it was the Conservative Party, or the Tories, never entered into that conversation, never crossed Trump's mind as even a player in the next general election. And the fact that the support for the Tories is now lower than it was in their terrible, historically bad election results last year, it tells you everything you need to know. So I think Trump got that right in terms of it being the Tories are out of the race.
It's a pretty bleak picture for the Conservative Party, man. Now, migration has already been mentioned, and I think one of the kind of biggest threats, I mean, generally the West is facing is migration. And I was always surprised how Britain wasn't able to be more effective on migration. You're an island, so we're here in Hungary, we're a landlocked nation, and our government built a fence on the border to stop the million people trying to get in on the southern border, even though, as I said, it's a landlocked country. So for you guys, it will be much easier. And Dominic already kind of touched upon the legal barriers. I mean, the Supreme Court in the UK, I personally think is like, I mean, completely alien to the British constitutional system. But also, I think the courage is missing in the end because Hungary is still a EU member state. We are paying actually a fine to the EU every day because of our migration policy. So we are in the courts, we are being constantly attacked. But as I said, I mean, you're an island. At least you're not in the European Union. You don't have the European Court of Justice anymore. You still have the Human Rights Courts, which is I mean, that's a big failure of Theresa May, that she couldn't get out of that.
But you've got a government that actually wants to deal with it. And the core of this, so we had the 2019 election. We said in the 2019 election, very explicitly, we are going to have a system for immigration like the Australian point system, and that's going to mean that for a very small number of extremely high-skilled people like professors of physics or whatever, low friction for you. But we're going to really try and we're going to massively reduce unskilled and low-skilled immigration. We said that explicitly in the election campaign. In January 2020, we actually started to implement that, and I had meetings with the Home Office about building the exact border control system finally so that Britain could count in everybody and count them out, and also count in and out things physically in the border IT system, etc. All of that work started in 2020. After we left, the Vote Leave team left in November 2020, in 2021, Boris and Sunak dismantled the whole thing. They even flipped the definition of high-skilled immigration and just made it low-skilled social care workers from Africa. Right, completely insane. And so, yes, there's been a complete failure on asylum seekers and the stupid boats and illegal immigration, but also most of the people coming in was deliberate and legal because the Conservative Party said, we actually want to do this. And if you see, even after these extraordinary numbers came out, and even after voters all over the country saying, my sister can't get a doctor's appointment, this is a complete disaster, Boris and minister after minister from the Tory party went on TV and defended it and said, no, 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 this was the right thing to do, and we're happy that we did it. Very similarly, in the last couple of weeks, after the Afghan debacle that was kept secret, also leaked out into the media because the court injunction stopped. As discussed before, Ben Wallace and all of these Secretary of State for Defence, all these other ministers, literally went on TV and said they were proud of it. Proud of the secret process flying over Taliban terrorists. So that really sums up. It's important to realise a lot of what you see is incompetence. But a lot of it isn't incompetence. A lot of it is Conservative Party figures wanted to do these things and remain proud of what they did. And that is crucial to remember when you're thinking about the evolution of the next few years in South Africa. I'll give you an example today, right? The Online Safety Act is now being applied, the first stage of it is now being applied in Britain, which means that increasingly in Britain you see stuff on Twitter is censored, and you can't read it. Oh, you'd think, obviously, Kemi Badenoch, the new leader of the Conservative Party, will be all over TV saying that this is ludicrous and we're going to change it and blah, blah. No, tumbleweed blowing. Why? Because Kemi, along with most of the Tory MPs, are proud of bringing in this exact act, which is now being used by Labour for censorship. So this is very important, I think, to keep in mind when you're thinking about the next few years. The mainstream of the Conservative Party is essentially, has been and remains indistinguishable from Labour and the Lib Dems and the far left on many of the most important issues.
Yeah.
Please, Jacob.
I'd just add two things to the migration story that have really accelerated and made lots of these problems worse, I think. One is that the way the British economy is set up is meant that it's become even though even in the medium term it's kind of disastrous, the numbers of people that are being imported, but politicians have been able to use mass low-skill immigration to solve specific problems, like the social care problem, and generally the economy runs on low-skill migration, like some kind of
Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, like
it's
some kind of Ponzi.
scheme.
You need more and more and more every time to make the system work, and so that's really exciting. It's become an easy way out of avoiding difficult conversations about the economy to import more people. And secondly is the way in which, through a strange mix of the courts and ideology, almost everybody involved in government and the state seems to make no distinction between British people who live and work in Britain and anybody else anywhere in the world. And so the whole system is almost set up in a way that anybody in the world has just as much right to enjoy the protections of British constitutional law and the opportunities that there still are in Britain to find work and make a family and all the rest of it. And people just seem to think that there's no difference at all between somebody who's a native Brit who lives in Britain and someone anywhere else in the world, which is why you can have a system, like a situation like in the Afghan debacle, where the state seemed to believe its overriding priority. Another word of Ben was like, we have a response. My first priority, I think he said, was to those people in Afghanistan, these Afghani terrorists, his first priority. And so people have completely flipped and lost any sense that their job as politicians is to present the interests of British people first and foremost, even if that means sometimes we have to say, sorry, you live in a nasty situation, but we have to take the interests of our country really seriously. And the degree to which that mindset, that ideology is embedded right across the political class and the institutions is really profound. And one of the things that a new government, the reform government, have to do is from day one say, whether it's required some kind of constitutional amendment or whatever, but make clear in a determinative and kind of proud sense that the job of a British government is to represent the interests of British people. And it seems mad that you might need to even say that, and whether we have to go off and get civil servants to sign an oath or something, but you need a demonstration that from now on things change and that the job of a government and of the institutions of Britain is to put British people first.
Yeah, I mean, that's all correct, but you can see it's even more extreme in the sense that any element in Britain which tries to argue the opposite is immediately labelled. So if things that I've just said are labelled by the mainstream in Westminster as obviously fascist, obviously far right. So something which would be completely uncontentious even 30 years ago in Britain, that obviously the first duty of the British government is to British people, is itself now defined as essentially a fascist point of view. And you can see increasingly, there's a kind of logic to what they say, that lots of the people, you can see retired civil servants on Twitter and whatnot, just very openly state, literally, the MP should explain to the British public that we have no actual right to inhabit this island. It's just a fluke of history. We have no more right to be here than anybody else at any other corner of the earth. And what we need is a political force that just explains that to the British and explains that they're just going to have to put up with essentially infinite immigration, and that's a good thing, and any opposition to that is fascist. And it may seem like that what I'm saying is like too extreme to be true, but you can see ex-officials argue this very openly now in the public, in public debate.
Mick, you wanted to say something?
There are so many things now which are too extreme to be true, but that is actually what they're saying. You couldn't have imagined it happening 10 years ago. To go back, I agree with everything that's been said. To go back to your original question, Britain is an island, and so it is fundamentally, in the end, a question of political will, I think. We need a government that has the courage of its convictions, and there's two sides to that. One is you have to have convictions. You have to actually believe in national sovereignty and putting Britain first, and that we haven't had. Well, I don't know. We can debate how far back you'd have to go to find such a government. And secondly, you have to have the courage to implement that and to not be put off by being accused of being far-right, fascist or anything else, and to actually stick to your guns. And then, in an island, we ought to be able to protect ourselves and deal with our borders. And I think Hungary is a fantastic example of what a government with the courage of its convictions can do in terms of protecting its national sovereignty and its borders. If we look at what's happening now in Greece, Greece is still a member of the European Union, is still signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights, and is sending all of its boat migrants back to Turkey in very uncompromising fashion. So it can be done, but we need a complete and utter change of the political system. A government that has the courage of its convictions, that begins, and I think this is where Nigel's programme is clear. It begins by saying we've got to get out of the European Convention of Human Rights, and we've got to remove the Human Rights Act in Britain, which writes the European Convention of Human Rights into British law. So it's not just a European law, it's actually in domestic law, and that's what the Supreme Court uses to override Parliament in so many ways now. So that's a fundamental kind of starting point.
I'm sorry, gentlemen, I got a clear sign that we have to wrap the panel up. So please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists, Dominic, Jacob, Mick. Thank you for being here this early hour after partying yesterday. So thank you, and wish you a great day, the audience as well. Thank you again.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.